What can you really learn about the world's most isolated country by crossing it on a train? For me, the train ride to Pyongyang became a rare opportunity to observe a side of North Korea that few visitors ever experience. In this documentary, you will see what today's North Korea really looks like, beyond the political headlines. Today we are starting our railway adventure to Pyongyang, the capital city of North Korea, effectively the closest country in the world, which is currently accessible only for citizens of Russia. So here we are at Dandong railway station. This is the place from where daily passenger train to Pyongyang departs. In addition to this, 4 times a week, passenger train from Beijing to Pyongyang departs as well. And what happens here in Dandong is that the wagons from Beijing are being coupled with wagons which depart from Dandong, and they form one single train which eventually leaves for Pyongyang. Because this is an international train, you cannot purchase the ticket online. So for me, the ticket was purchased by some travel agents here in China, and then it was handed through a trustworthy person to me in Beijing. As it turned out, arriving at the station 2 hours before departure was completely unnecessary. The railway border crossing only opened at 9 a.m., exactly 1 hour before the train was scheduled to leave. Standing in the line, I found myself face to face with North Koreans. Very few North Koreans are actually allowed to travel abroad, so who were these people? International travel in North Korea is generally reserved for diplomats, government officials, people employed overseas, as well as a limited number of students, athletes, and performers. It was clear that the people standing behind me in the line were unlikely to be average citizens. Most of them probably belonged to a privileged segment of North Korean society. However, they looked quite ordinary to me, except one detail in their clothes. Badges. Small badges which carry great significance in North Korea. They typically feature portraits of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, or both leaders together. They're traditionally worn on the left side of the chest, close to the heart, and serve as a visible symbol of loyalty to the state and the ruling Kim dynasty.
Здравствуйте.
About 15 minutes before departure, boarding finally began. My carriage was a soft sleeper, a 4th-bed compartment that turned out to be surprisingly modern. This coach was equipped with air conditioning, power outlets for charging electronic devices, and looked brand new. Even the beds had already been made before we boarded.
There is the sink section and there is the bathroom, but the bathroom is currently closed. Total capacity is only 40 people.
Strangely enough, only 2 passengers in our wagon were me and my travel buddy. Apart from us, the only other people on board were the train attendants. At exactly 10 a.m., the train rolled out of Dandong station. To get into North Korea, the train had to cross the bridge over Yalu River, separating the Chinese city of Dandong from the North Korean city of Sinuiju. From the train window, we could see one of Dandong's most famous landmarks, the Broken Bridge. This was the bridge that once connected the 2 countries, but during the Korean War its northern section was destroyed by the US bombing. Today it ends abruptly in the middle of the river, preserved as a reminder of that conflict. Our train crossed the border on the neighboring Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge, a combined road and railway bridge that carries both vehicle and rail traffic. Nearly all overland travel between China and North Korea passes through this crossing. A few minutes after crossing the bridge, the train arrived in Sinuiju. Just moments earlier, the view from the window had been the bustling Chinese city of Dandong, with its lively riverfront filled with pedestrians and traffic. People could freely walk along the waterfront and enjoy the views across the river. At the same time, the North Korean waterfront was almost entirely deserted, with the exception of a couple of people. As the train passed the North Korean border checkpoint under the bridge, I noticed a long line of cargo trucks waiting to return to China after unloading their goods. Just 1 day earlier, I had witnessed an almost endless stream of trucks heading from China into North Korea. One after another, they were crossing the border, stopping only briefly whenever a train needed to pass. So apparently, despite international sanctions and North Korea's political isolation, commercial traffic across this border appears to be extremely active, and I was witnessing it firsthand. The train eventually arrived at Sinuiju railway station, where North Korean immigration and customs procedures would begin. Passengers do not leave the train. Instead, all immigration and customs inspections are carried out inside the carriages. To be honest, I had expected the border check to be far more intimidating. Instead, the officers were surprisingly polite and friendly.
Okay, so we successfully passed the border control in North Korea. Our passports are still held by apparently border guards. They will be given to us when the train will be departing.
The item that attracted the most attention was the South Korean currency carried by my travel companion. She had visited South Korea only a week before this trip, so she still had several Korean banknotes with her. Fortunately, this was not a problem at all. The officers simply asked her to declare the money. Once the formalities were complete, the North Korean border officers warmly welcomed us and even handed us a complimentary pack of North Korean cigarettes. We were even allowed to step off the train to smoke on the platform. This is apparently how the actual ticket looks. Funnily enough, there is information in Chinese, Russian, and German languages. During the long stop in Sinuiju, the staff from the restaurant brought a cart full of snacks, drinks and actual meals to our wagon. Each meal cost 40 RMB, which sounded reasonable by Chinese standards.
This is the Korean food. It's actually very solid meal with kimchi, good portion of meat, rice, apparently some chicken. This is the bottle of some also North Korean beer. Cost just 8 RMB. We were able to pay with yuan to ladies, and they gave us change in yuan as well. Okay, so we passed the customs and apparently leaving from Sinuiju. This is the North Korean border city, heading straight to the capital, to Pyongyang.
The journey from Sinuiju to Pyongyang takes about 5 hours. For me, the opportunity to travel to Pyongyang by train was one of the main reasons I decided to visit North Korea. I wanted to see not only Pyongyang, but also the stretch of the country that lies between the Chinese border and the capital. There is a widely held belief that the railway line between Sinuiju and Pyongyang is itself a kind of showcase for North Korea. Some argue that everything visible from the train has been carefully maintained for foreign visitors and does not necessarily reflect what the rest of the country looks like beyond the railway corridor. As I watched the landscape roll by, I was feeling far more like I was observing everyday life in ordinary small towns and villages than looking at a carefully staged display created for tourists. So we just entered the North Korean countryside. There is not so much to see apart from the fields where they supposedly grow rice, as you can see. Even though we were already inside North Korea, my phone was still able to connect to a Chinese mobile network. The signal was weak and unreliable, but it was enough to send the message in a messenger. At some point, modern skyscrapers of the Chinese city of Dandong rose above the skyline, forming a striking contrast with the North Korean farmland stretching across the foreground. That was the last moment when a signal from China could still reach across the border. A few minutes later, the connection disappeared completely. From that point onward, we were effectively cut off from the outside world. As I watched North Koreans going about their daily lives through the train window, many of them looked back at the passing train with exactly the same curiosity. Compared with many domestic passenger trains I saw along the route, the international coaches were noticeably better. It's possible that the train itself attracted attention simply because it stood out from the rolling stock that people were used to seeing every day. But the very first thing that became impossible to ignore was the sheer number of slogans. They were everywhere, along the railway, painted on the sides of buildings, and even in the middle of agricultural fields. Most of them promoted the ideology of Juche, the official state ideology of North Korea, first developed by Kim Il-sung. Although it is often described abroad as a form of communism, North Korea itself presents Juche as its own distinct political philosophy. At its core are the principles of national self-reliance and the country's ability to defend itself without relying on outside powers. Many of the slogans explicitly praise North Korea's leaders or call for loyalty to them. Others focus on agriculture, industry, military readiness, or the principles of Juche. Together they form a comprehensive propaganda system in which virtually every aspect of public life is connected to the leadership of the Kim family. personality cult surrounding North Korea's leaders was impossible to overlook during the train journey. At every major railway station, large portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il could be seen prominently displayed on station buildings. However, they are no longer visible at every station. It may be related to the size or function of a particular station, ongoing renovations, or other administrative factors, but there is no publicly available evidence that explains exactly why some stations feature the portraits while others do not. For most of the journey, the railway runs parallel to local roads. Very few of them were paved, except major streets in towns. Most were either dirt or gravel roads connecting small towns and rural communities. However, these roads were far from deserted. Quite frequently I saw buses along with cargo trucks. Some people were even carried inside trucks in their cargo compartments. Passenger cars also appeared from time to time. They certainly were not super common, but it would be inaccurate to say that private vehicles don't exist in rural North Korea. Speaking about the type of transport used by ordinary people, bicycles. They were by far the most common sight on the roads. Motorcycles were also fairly frequent, and perhaps most unexpectedly, so were electric scooters. Much of this equipment has likely been imported from China, North Korea's largest trading partner. If you ever got curious how the bathroom looks in North Korean train, it's pretty simple, similar to Chinese trains actually. Just the squat toilet, and that's it. Here is the sink. Oh, they actually have some toilet paper. Check it out. Despite the gradual growth of road transport in recent decades, rail continues to serve as the backbone of the country's transportation system. Most of the station buildings I passed were seemingly well maintained, with freshly painted facades and tidy surroundings. Several train stations in Pyongyang appear to have undergone renovation in recent years, reinforcing the impression that the capital receives considerably greater investment than much of the rest of the country. Passenger cars of local North Korean trains showed signs of decades of continuous use, although they were generally not that bad, just very old compared to the international train I was taking. The majority of locomotives I saw on the network were electric. North Korea has electrified much of its main railway network over several decades. Given the country's limited domestic petroleum resources and its long-standing dependence on imported fuel, electrification allows much of the railway to operate with significantly lower fuel consumption. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of North Korean railways is the extent to which existing equipment has been rebuilt rather than replaced. One of the examples is the Soviet-built M62 diesel locomotive manufactured in Luhansk for railways throughout the former socialist bloc. In North Korea, some of these trains continue to operate in their original diesel configuration, while others have undergone an extraordinary transformation. Instead of being retired, they have been rebuilt as electric locomotives, fitted with pantographs to collect power from the overhead catenary. So we've been driving across North Korea for nearly 2.5 hours already. Mostly you see the fields and occasionally the mountains through the window of the train. Frequently they are changed by local settlements, villages, some small towns. You can clearly see people, their ordinary life. I think it's fair to say that North Korea is a poor country, yet it also looked remarkably clean and orderly. I would say that roadsides were generally free of trash and many of the settlements appeared well maintained, although small houses looked rather old and we couldn't see what was inside them. I took this shot somewhere around the city of Cheongju. It shows a group of people having lunch. Women in the foreground appear to be North Korean soldiers. You can spot a female soldier's cap on the wooden roof near the top center of the image. There is a North Korean military jacket hanging there as well. The structure where they prepared food was made from scrap materials, which made me assume that perhaps they didn't have money or the materials to build a more substantial structure. Same applies to the greenhouse or perhaps rest area which doesn't even have a solid roof. During several hours of traveling through the countryside, I didn't see a single modern combine harvester or other large mechanized farming equipment. The only tractors I encountered were very old machines that appeared to date back several decades. Everything else seemed to rely overwhelmingly on manual labor. In many places, fields were still being plowed using animal-drawn plows. People worked with hoes or pulled weeds by hand. Limited mechanization, shortage of fuel, restricted access to modern equipment, and decades of economic constraints have all contributed to an agricultural sector that remains technologically undeveloped by contemporary standards. By the way, agriculture in North Korea continues to be organized largely through cooperative farms, a system established decades ago in which farmland is cultivated collectively rather than being privately owned. That's why you could see large groups of people working together in the fields.
Smoking is harmful, but the cool feature of North Korean trains is that you're kind of like allowed to smoke everywhere, even inside passenger compartments of passenger trains.
Don't be surprised by the sudden change of scenery. Some of the footage you are seeing now was filmed on our return journey as we traveled from Pyongyang back to China. Unlike our trip into North Korea, when we had an almost empty soft sleeper carriage to ourselves, the return journey took place in a hard sleeper coach that was occupied by a number of other passengers. Apart from us, there were North Koreans and Chinese people. Most of the North Koreans gathered toward the far end of the coach. The Chinese passengers, as it usually happens, chatted loudly, ate food, smoked cigarettes and drank alcohol. They weren't tourists because at the time this footage was filmed, organized tourism from China to North Korea had not resumed yet.
Or not, but we have finally entered Pyongyang. You can see just by the architecture, so some of the high rises are visible through the window, which basically marks the outskirts of the city, and it's just roughly 10 to 15 minutes to the main station of the city.
At around 6 o'clock in the evening, our train finally arrived at Pyongyang railway station. From the moment we crossed the North Korean border until our arrival in Pyongyang, we had traveled without tour guides. Of course, we couldn't leave the train, but those few hours were the only part of the trip during which we were not constantly accompanied. Waiting for us on the platform were our two guides, Mr. Kim and Miss Lin. It was already Friday night, so our first and only stop was dinner at a restaurant. We were served a generous selection of traditional Korean dishes. I wouldn't consider this representative of what an average North Korean eats on a daily basis. Foreign visitors are taken to restaurants specifically prepared for tourists, making it almost impossible to observe the everyday diet of ordinary residents. The drive to the restaurant, however, gave me my very first glimpse of Pyongyang and immediately challenged some of my expectations. I had imagined a quiet city with relatively little traffic. Instead, the streets were surprisingly lively with roads full of cars, crowded public transport and busy sidewalks.
Мы никак не ожидали увидеть столько автомобилей в Пхеньяне. Это с недавних пор, да, их стало столько много?
Ага.
Очень много машин.
Да. И есть наши производственные. И вы видите, вот цвет, но номера это разные. Желтые это частные, и синие это государственные, черные это военные, и красные и зеленые это для иностранцев.
Supposedly starting from 2025, car ownership in Pyongyang appears to have increased, as access to private vehicles has gradually expanded for certain segments of the population. Cars remain beyond the reach of most North Koreans, but in Pyongyang, it's even possible to get stuck in a small traffic jam these days. After dinner, we checked into the Yangkak-do International Hotel, which remains one of the 2 hotels in Pyongyang currently used to accommodate foreigners. There it is, it's situated on an island in the middle of the river. We were free to move around inside the hotel, visit its restaurants and shops, and even step outside to the designated smoking area. But what we could not do was leave the hotel grounds without our guides.